She walked into that courtroom wearing the same black dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral. No lawyer, no family beside her, just a worn leather Bible clutched against her chest and 23 years of silence sitting heavy on her shoulders. The judge asked her to state her name for the record. She did, and then she said, "Before we begin, Your Honor, I need to tell this court something that nobody in this room is prepared to hear." Every pen stopped moving, every breath held. What came next didn't just change the verdict. It changed everything anyone in that courtroom thought they knew about justice, loyalty, and the price a woman pays for keeping a secret that was never hers to keep. Now, before I tell you what she said, I need to ask you something. Have you ever kept a secret so long it started to feel like a second heartbeat? Something you carried so quietly that people looked right at you and never once suspected the weight you were holding? Because this woman, this widow in her funeral dress, she carried hers for over 2 decades, through grief, through poverty, through a trial that was supposed to destroy her. And the moment she finally let it go, the whole room changed. If you've ever protected someone who didn't deserve your protection, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know what city is with us tonight. Hit that like button before we go further, because I promise you, by the time we reach that courtroom moment, you're going to want to share this one. And if you're new here, subscribe now, because we tell stories like this every week. All right, let's go back to the beginning. The town of Hollow Creek, Kentucky, is the kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps, not because it's too small, but because it seems to prefer it that way. Tucked between 2 ridgelines in the eastern part of the state, it had one main road, one diner, one sheriff's department, and the kind of institutional memory that never let anyone forget anything. People there didn't just know their neighbors. They knew their neighbors' grandparents. They knew who owed whom. They knew which families carried old money and which ones carried old shame. Nessa had grown up knowing exactly which category she belonged to. Born Nessa Calloway, the youngest daughter of a tobacco farmer who died before she turned 12. She had learned early that in Hollow Creek a woman without a man was a woman without standing. Her mother, Opaline, had kept the family together through cleaning houses and taking in laundry, and she had raised Nessa with one quiet instruction that functioned more like a warning: keep your head down and your business to yourself. Nessa had done exactly that her entire life. She married young, 21, to a man named Corwin, who was 10 years older and worked at the county assessor's office. He wasn't a romantic figure. He didn't sweep her off her feet. But he was steady, and steadiness was something Nessa had never been able to take for granted. He paid the bills. He fixed things when they broke. He came home every night. For 17 years, that was enough. They had one daughter, Lena, who had her father's quiet and her mother's eyes. Nessa raised her mostly in the background of Corwin's life, his schedules, his routines, his long silences at the kitchen table with paperwork she was never invited to look at. She didn't ask questions. That was part of the arrangement, though it had never been spoken aloud. Then, 8 years ago, Corwin died of a heart attack in the parking lot of the county building on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was 54 years old. The death was unremarkable, medically speaking, the kind of thing that happens to men who drink too much coffee and never go to the doctor. Nessa buried him, collected herself, and began the process of becoming invisible in an entirely new way, not as someone's wife, but as someone's widow. She sold the house because she couldn't afford the payments. She moved into a small rental on the edge of town. She cleaned houses like her mother before her. Lena finished school, got a scholarship to a state university, and left Hollow Creek with the kind of relief that children feel when they love a parent but cannot survive the town that raised them. Nessa didn't blame her. She lived quietly for years, went to church, kept a garden, spoke to no one about anything that mattered, and then Aldrich Fontaine came back to town. Aldrich had left Hollow Creek 30 years ago under circumstances that had generated exactly the kind of gossip that never fully dies. He had been Corwin's closest friend. his business partner in a sense, before there was any official business between them. And now he had returned, older, wealthier, dressed in city clothes, to claim ownership of a parcel of land on the eastern ridge that he said Corwin had promised him in a private agreement made 2 decades prior. The agreement, he claimed, was documented, and the documentation pointed directly at Nessa as the person who owed him what her husband had promised. The civil suit was filed on a Thursday. By Friday, all of Hallow Creek knew about it. By the following Monday, Nessa had received her first notice to appear. The courthouse in Hallow Creek was a building that had once tried to be grand. It had columns that were slightly too thin for their height, and a clock tower that hadn't kept accurate time in 15 years. Inside, the main courtroom smelled of old wood and older decisions, and the benches that served as the gallery could hold at capacity about 60 people. On the first day of the Fontaine civil proceeding, every seat was taken. Aldrich arrived with 2 attorneys from Lexington, both of them wearing suits that cost more than Nessa's monthly rent. He was a trim man in his early 60s with silver hair and the practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades winning arguments in rooms full of skeptical people. He shook hands with the bailiff. He smiled at the clerk. He was visibly comfortable. Nessa arrived alone. She had considered asking the legal aid office in the next county for help, and she had been placed on a waiting list. The case moved faster than the list. So she sat at the respondent's table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the knowledge that she was almost certainly going to lose. The claim Aldrich presented was detailed and, on its surface, convincing. He produced a handwritten letter, allegedly authored by Corwin, which outlined a verbal agreement made in 1998. In exchange for a sum of money provided by Aldrich, money that had helped stabilize the Calloway family during a financial crisis Nessa hadn't known was a crisis. Corwin had promised Aldrich first right to a parcel of land that Corwin intended to eventually purchase on the Eastern Ridge. The land, as it happened, had come up for sale 2 years after Corwin's death. Nessa, not knowing about any such agreement, had quietly purchased it with a small inheritance from her mother. It was the only real asset she owned. She rented a portion of it to a neighboring farmer for grazing, and that income was the margin between paying her bills and not paying them. Aldrich wanted the land, or failing that, fair market compensation. The letter, examined by a handwriting consultant hired by Aldrich's team, was authenticated as consistent with Corwin's writing. A second document, a wire transfer record, showed a significant sum moving from an account associated with Aldrich into an account associated with the Calloway household in the spring of 1998. It looked clean. It looked documented. It looked, from the outside, like an open and shut matter of a widow who had unknowingly inherited a debt her husband had carried in secret. The judge assigned to the case was a woman named Honorine Beckett, who had been on the Hallow Creek bench for 11 years and who had developed a reputation for patience with pro-se litigants. She gave Nessa ample opportunity to respond, to ask questions, to request continuances. Nessa asked for very little. She listened to everything. She wrote things down. She looked at Aldrich when he spoke, and Aldrich, for his part, did not look at her. After the first day, a local woman named Bet, who ran the diner near the square, found Nessa sitting in her car in the parking lot at 5:30 in the afternoon, still holding her legal pad, staring at nothing. Bet brought her a cup of coffee and sat in the passenger seat without asking. "You doing all right?" Bet said. "I'm thinking," Nessa said. "Thinking about what?" Nessa was quiet for a long moment. "About how long a secret needs to be kept before the keeping of it becomes the same as a lie." Betta didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they sat together until the parking lot emptied and the courthouse lights went off one by one. What Nessa had not told anyone, not the court, not Bet, not even her daughter Lena in their weekly phone calls, was that she knew exactly what the money had been for. She had always known. In the spring of 1998, Corwin had come home late on a Wednesday night and sat down at the kitchen table and told her, with the flat affect of a man delivering a weather report, that he had made a serious mistake at work. Not a small error, not a paperwork oversight. A deliberate, calculated act of fraud, the falsification of assessment records for 3 properties owned by a developer named Gus Prentice, who had paid Corwin to undervalue the parcels so that Prentice could acquire adjacent land at below-market rates. It wasn't enormous by the standards of what public corruption could be, but it was enough. More than enough to end his career, his pension, and his freedom, if it was ever uncovered. Corwin had told her this, not because he wanted her counsel, but because he needed her silence, and he needed her to understand why a man named Aldrich Fontaine was about to send them a significant amount of money. Aldrich had known about the scheme. Aldrich had, in fact, introduced Corwin to Gus Prentice in the first place. When the arrangement started to feel unstable, when Prentice began behaving erratically and Corwin feared exposure, it was Aldrich who had provided the money to make certain records disappear and certain mouths stay closed. But Aldrich had not done this out of friendship. He had done it as an investment. The investment, as Corwin explained it that night at the kitchen table, was the promise of the Eastern Ridgeland, a parcel that Aldrich believed would eventually be worth something significant if a particular highway expansion project went through as rumored. Nessa had listened to all of this. She had not cried. She had not raised her voice. She had asked one question: "Are we going to be all right?" Corwin had said yes, and she had believed him, because believing him was the only available option. She had kept the secret for 23 years, through Corwin's life and through his death, through the quiet erosion of her own sense of herself as a woman with moral standing. She had kept it because exposing it would have meant exposing Corwin, and exposing Corwin would have meant losing what little they had and becoming, in the eyes of Hallow Creek, not just a widow of modest means, but a fraud's wife. She had chosen the version of herself that could survive, but now Aldrich was in that courtroom claiming the fruits of a corrupt bargain as though it were a simple debt, as though the money he had sent had been a loan between gentlemen, as though Nessa was simply a woman who had inherited property she didn't deserve, and he was doing it in front of a judge, officially, under oath. Nessa's daughter Lena called on a Tuesday night during the second week of hearings. Lena was 26, sharp-minded, working in public health in Louisville. She had a way of asking questions that arrived from unexpected angles. "Mom," she said, "you've been very calm about all of this. You're not a calm person usually." "I'm thinking," Nessa said. It was becoming her answer to everything. "What are you thinking about? About whether the truth does more damage coming out or staying in?" There was a pause on the line. "Mom, is there something you haven't told me?" "There's something I haven't told anyone," Nessa said. "I'm still deciding what to do with it." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it going to help you?" "It might." "Then tell it," Lena said, "whatever it costs." Nessa spent 3 evenings at her kitchen table with a composition notebook and a ballpoint pen. She wrote everything down, every detail she could remember from that night in 1998. The names, the numbers, the nature of the arrangement, the wire transfer, the records that had been altered, the properties, the developer, the highway expansion project that had, in the years since, in fact come to pass, which was precisely why Aldrich now believed the Eastern Ridgeland was worth the trouble of a lawsuit. She did not write in the manner of someone building a legal argument. She wrote the way her mother had taught her to pray, plainly without performance, with the understanding that you were speaking to something that already knew the whole of it anyway. When she was done, she had 14 pages. She read them twice. Then she put them in an envelope and went to sleep. The next morning, she drove to the next county and found the legal aid office and waited 3 hours to speak to a young attorney named Soren, who was 29 years old, clearly exhausted and clearly not expecting what she was about to hand him. He read her 14 pages in silence. It took him a long time. She waited. When he looked up, his expression was not the expression of a man who had found a legal advantage. It was the expression of a man who had just understood the true shape of something he had assumed was much simpler. "Mrs. Calloway," he said carefully, "you understand that what you've written here, if you present it, would expose your late husband to posthumous findings of fraud and corruption." "Yes," she said, "it may also open the door to further investigation of the Prentice transactions, the county assessor's office, the highway contracts." "Yes," she said again, "it would damage his memory. Here in town, people would—" "I know what people would do," she said. "I've lived here my whole life." Soren set the papers down. "Why are you willing to do this now?" She looked at him for a long moment. He was young enough that she found herself thinking about what Lena might say in this situation. The directness her daughter had inherited from God knows where, because it hadn't come from either of her parents. "Because Aldrich Fontaine is standing in front of a judge," Nessa said, "presenting a corrupt bargain as an honest debt, and he's doing it under oath. And I am not going to sit quietly while a man who helped my husband do something shameful uses that shame to take the only thing I have left." Soren was quiet. "Also," she said, "my daughter told me to tell it, whatever it costs." There was a long silence in that small office that smelled of takeout containers and coffee, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing necessary work with insufficient resources. "All right," Soren said at last, "then we need to talk about how to do this." He worked for 2 weeks without billing her a dime. He filed motions she didn't fully understand. He subpoenaed records she didn't know how to request. He found a forensic accountant in Frankfurt willing to examine the wire transfer documents in the context of the broader county records. What the accountant found, buried in a decade's worth of assessment filings, was a pattern. Not just the 3 properties Nessa remembered. There were 11 irregular assessments over a period of 6 years, all connected to parcels in which Gus Prentice had a financial interest. The falsifications were subtle, the kind of thing that would have required access to internal systems and working knowledge of the filing process, the kind of access a county assessor's employee would have, the kind of knowledge Corwin had possessed. Aldrich Fontaine, the documents suggested, had not merely known about one isolated act of fraud. He had been the consistent intermediary, the man who introduced the right people to one another, who facilitated the payments, who ensured that everything stayed quiet. The original lawsuit, filed in Aldrich's name, was beginning to look like the single worst decision he had made in 30 years. The morning of the 5th hearing, Hallow Creek woke up and discovered that 2 things had happened overnight. First, a reporter from a regional newspaper based in Lexington had filed a story, based on court documents that were public record, outlining the dimensions of what the Fontaine civil case might actually involve. The headline was careful, the language was qualified, but the implication was clear. What had begun as a property dispute was beginning to look like the surface of something much larger. Second, Gus Prentice, who was now in his mid-70s and lived in a retirement community outside of Bowling Green, had received a phone call from an attorney informing him that his name had appeared in subpoenaed records related to an ongoing civil matter in Hallow Creek, Kentucky. By the time Nessa arrived at the courthouse that morning, there were people standing outside who had not been there before. Not just the usual observers, there were faces she didn't recognize. A woman with a notebook, a man with a phone held at an angle that suggested he was recording. Bet from the diner had pressed a thermos of coffee into her hands in the parking lot. "You going to be okay in there?" Bet asked. "I don't know," Nessa said honestly. "You want me to come in?" "You can't do anything." "I can sit behind you," Bet said. "So you know somebody's there." Nessa looked at her. This woman she had known peripherally for 20 years, who had never been a close friend, who had simply shown up in a parking lot with a cup of coffee at the right moment. "All right," Nessa said. "Come in then." Inside, Soren met her at the respondents' table with the expression that was carefully composed but betrayed around the edges, the controlled anxiety of a young attorney about to do something genuinely consequential. "They've filed a motion to exclude the supplementary evidence," he said quietly. "Aldrich's team is arguing it's outside the scope of the civil matter." "What does Judge Beckett say?" "She hasn't ruled yet. She'll hear arguments this morning." Aldrich sat at the plaintiff's table. He was composed. He looked, if anything, slightly more polished than usual, as though he had decided that increased elegance was the appropriate response to increased pressure. He did not look at Nessa. Judge Beckett entered at 9 o'clock precisely. She settled herself, reviewed her notes, and then looked across the courtroom with the particular gaze of someone who had spent 11 years reading rooms and had learned to read this one faster than most. "Before we address the pending motion," she said, "I want to understand the current posture of this case. Mr. Fontaine." She turned to him. "Your original claim is for either title to the parcel on the eastern ridge or monetary compensation in the assessed market value. Is that still the relief you're seeking?" "Yes, Your Honor," said the senior Lexington attorney. "And Mrs. Calloway." The judge turned to Nessa's side of the room. "You intend to contest the validity of the underlying agreement on the grounds that it was made in connection with an illegal act. Is that your defense?" Soren started to speak, but Nessa put a hand on his arm. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. In a room that had already begun to settle into listening, it carried all the way to the back wall. "May I speak directly?" Judge Beckett studied her for a moment. "You may." Aldrich's attorney began an objection. The judge raised one finger without looking at him, and the objection stopped. "Mrs. Calloway," the judge said. "Go ahead." The room went very still. It was the particular stillness of 60 people deciding simultaneously to stop breathing. Nessa stood up. She smoothed the front of her black dress, the same one she had worn to Corwin's funeral, because it was the only formal garment she owned, and it was, she had decided that morning while dressing, appropriate. You should dress for truth, the same way you dress for grief, simply, without pretense. She looked at the judge. "My husband, Corwin Calloway, falsified property assessment records for 11 parcels in this county over a period of 6 years, she said. He did this in exchange for payments coordinated by Aldrich Fontaine, who served as intermediary between my husband and a developer named Gus Prentice. The stillness deepened. It became a different kind of stillness, the kind that exists in the moment before something that cannot be unsaid gets said. "I knew about this," Nessa continued. "Not while it was happening. Corwin told me after the fact, when the arrangement had already been made and the money had already been sent. He told me because he needed my silence, and I gave it to him. I gave it to him for 23 years. She could hear the sound of someone shifting in the gallery. She did not look back. "The money that Mr. Fontaine is now characterizing as a loan, as a debt my husband owed him, was not a loan. It was a payment made to ensure that my husband would continue to falsify records and that neither of them would expose the other. It was, in the plainest language I know, hush money paid between two men who had done something wrong and needed each other to stay quiet." Aldrich's senior attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Beckett said. Her voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It was simply unambiguous. The attorney sat. "Mrs. Calloway," the judge said, "you understand you're making statements that have potential implications beyond this civil matter." "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're making them voluntarily, without coercion." "Yes. Continue." Nessa took a breath. She had rehearsed this. Not the words, exactly. She had learned from 14 pages of composition notebook that the words would come. But the breath was the thing she had practiced. "My husband is dead," she said. "He cannot be tried for what he did. He cannot defend himself, and I am not here to prosecute him. I loved him in the way you love someone who was both reliable and disappointing, which is the way most people love the people they spend their lives with." A sound in the gallery that might have been the beginning of something and then caught itself. "But Aldrich Fontaine is alive. He is in this courtroom. He is attempting under oath, in front of a judge, to collect on a promise made in the context of a criminal conspiracy, and he is doing it by presenting himself as a creditor and me as a debtor, and I am not willing to let that happen." She reached into the folder Soren had placed in front of her and removed a single document, A copy of her handwritten account, notarized, submitted into evidence 3 days prior. I have given this court a full written account of everything my husband told me. I have provided records, obtained through my attorney, that corroborate the pattern of falsification across 11 separate assessment filings. I have given the court the name of the developer. I have given the court dates, amounts, and property addresses. She set the document down. I do not expect this to be easy for this town. Corwin worked in that county building for over 20 years. People knew him. People trusted him, the way you trust a man who shows up and does his job and doesn't make a fuss. Her voice, which had been steady throughout, shifted slightly, not breaking, steadying further, the way a rope goes taut under real weight. But the thing about secrets, she said, is that they don't stay where you put them. They move around, they get into the walls. And eventually the house itself starts to feel like the secret, like everything in it is built on something you're not allowed to look at directly. She turned then, just slightly, just enough to see Aldrich Fontaine directly. He was looking at the table in front of him. I am 59 years old, Nessa said. I have cleaned other people's houses for 30 years. I have one piece of land that I purchased honestly, with money my mother left me, and that land is the only financial security I have ever had. And this man, she did not gesture, did not point, simply spoke. This man came back to Hallow Creek after 30 years and filed a lawsuit to take it from me, using a document that exists because my husband committed fraud. She looked back at the judge. I should have told this a long time ago. I know that. I told myself I was protecting Corwin. I told myself I was protecting Lena, my daughter. I told myself a lot of things that were true enough to be convincing and not true enough to be honest. A pause. The only thing I can do now is say it plainly and let the court decide what to do with it. That's all I have. I don't have a lawyer who costs what those lawyers cost. I don't have 30 years of business connections and a good suit. I have what I know. And what I know is that the agreement Aldrich Fontaine is calling a debt doesn't deserve to be honored because it was never made in honor. She sat down. The courtroom remained silent for what felt to everyone in it like a very long time. Judge Beckett made no expression. She looked at her papers. She looked at Aldrich's table where both attorneys were conferring in rapid, barely audible whispers. She looked at the gallery, which had the collective posture of people who had arrived expecting a property dispute and found themselves inside something they would be describing to people for years. Then the judge said, quietly and precisely, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." She stood. The room stood. And in the 18 seconds between the judge leaving her bench and the first sound of conversation breaking out in the gallery, Bet, sitting in the second row, behind Nessa, leaned forward and put her hand on Nessa's shoulder. Nessa reached up and covered it with her own. The civil case of Fontaine versus Calloway was dismissed 11 days later. Judge Beckett's written ruling was 42 pages. The essential finding was that the agreement underlying Aldrich's claim was unenforceable as a matter of public policy. A contract made in furtherance of a criminal enterprise could not be litigated as a legitimate debt. The supplementary evidence, which the judge declined to exclude, had established sufficient grounds to refer the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of the broader assessment fraud. Aldrich Fontaine left Hallow Creek the day after the dismissal was filed. His attorneys sent a brief statement to the local paper saying that their client disagreed with the ruling and was evaluating his options. No appeal was ever filed. Gus Prentice, reached by phone by the regional newspaper, declined to comment. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal inquiry 6 weeks later. The inquiry was not about Corwin, the dead could not be charged, but about the integrity of county assessment records across a 12-year period and the involvement of outside parties in manipulating them. Aldrich's name appeared prominently in the investigative documents. Nessa was interviewed twice as a cooperating witness. Both times she answered every question. She did not enjoy any of it. On a Thursday afternoon in late spring, Soren called her to tell her that the inquiry had resulted in a referral for criminal charges against Aldrich on 2 counts related to the original scheme. The news arrived the same week her neighbour's cattle were grazing peacefully on the eastern ridge parcel, the grass green and unhurried under a sky that was doing nothing more complicated than being blue. "How do you feel?" Soren asked her. She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Like something finished," she said. "Not fixed, just finished." Lena drove down from Louisville that weekend. They didn't talk about the case much. They planted tomatoes in the small garden behind the rental house and ate dinner on the porch and watched the light change over the ridge line. And Nessa thought about her mother, who had taught her to keep her head down and her business to herself, and wondered if Opaline would have understood what she'd done, or if understanding was something that required a distance her mother had never been allowed. She decided in the quiet of that particular evening that her mother would have understood. Not immediately, but eventually. That was enough. There's a photograph that Lena took that weekend. Her mother at the kitchen table, early morning, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking out the window toward the ridge. The light is the pale gold of early May in Kentucky, the kind that arrives without announcement and stays just long enough to make you believe summer is possible. Nessa looks tired in the photograph. She looks like a woman who has spent a very long time carrying something and has only recently begun to reckon with the shape of her own arms without it. She also looks unmistakably like herself. Lena posted the photograph without caption, because there wasn't a caption that would have improved it, and because some things are better when they arrive without explanation. People in Hallow Creek continued to have opinions about Nessa Calloway. This was, of course, inevitable. Some of them thought she had done something brave. Some of them thought she had been disloyal to Corwin's memory. Some of them thought it was complicated, which was probably the most honest position, though not the most comfortable. Bet at the diner always gave her coffee for free after that. It was never discussed. It was simply the new arrangement. The eastern ridgeland remained in Nessa's name. The neighboring farmer renewed his grazing lease for another 3 years. The highway that had run past the ridge, the one that Aldrich had believed would make the parcel valuable, carried trucks and commuters and the ordinary freight of ordinary lives, indifferent to what had been transacted in its proximity. In the fall of the following year, Nessa began volunteering twice a week at the legal aid office in the next county. She wasn't an attorney. She couldn't give legal advice. But she could sit across from people who were frightened and overwhelmed and hand them a cup of coffee and help them organize their papers and tell them, without making it a speech, that it was worth saying the true thing, even when the true thing was expensive. Soren said once that she was better at it than half the attorneys he knew because she never made the people feel like problems to be solved. "You make them feel like they matter," he said. "They do matter," she said, as though the alternative hadn't occurred to her. She still wore the black dress to things that required formality. She had never bought another one. She thought sometimes that this was stubborn and possibly strange, and she thought it anyway without changing her mind. There was one other thing. On the night before the last day of the Fontaine hearing, the night before she stood up and said what she said, Nessa had gone home and opened the composition notebook to the last page, the one after the 14 pages of account, and she had written 2 sentences. She hadn't planned to write them. They had arrived the way things arrive when you're not bracing for them. "I am sorry I waited so long. I am not sorry I did it." She left those sentences in the notebook. She didn't share them with anyone. They weren't for the court or for her daughter or for Hallow Creek or for anyone who would one day want to know how she felt about what she'd done. They were for Opaline, and for the version of herself that had sat at a kitchen table in 1998 and listened to a man confess and then folded herself into silence like a letter that never got sent. That woman deserved 2 sentences. She had earned at least that much. Here's what I keep coming back to, thinking about Nessa Calloway. She didn't walk into that courtroom with a plan to be courageous. She walked in wearing a funeral dress and carrying a Bible because those were the things she had. She stood up and told the truth, not because she was fearless, but because she had finally done the math on what silence was actually costing her. And the number was too high. Most people, when they carry a secret for 23 years, don't let it go because they've found courage. They let it go because one day the weight becomes more than the protection is worth. Because someone comes to take the last thing you have and uses your own buried shame as the tool to do it. And in that moment, the secret stops being a shelter and starts being a weapon aimed at you. Nessa saw that, and she made her choice. That's the part that stays with me. Not the legal outcome, not the investigation or the dismissal or any of the official machinery that followed, but a woman in a black dress, placing one hand on the table in front of her to steady herself, saying the true thing out loud in a room full of people who weren't ready to hear it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the things you carry and what they're costing you, leave a comment below. Tell me what city you're in. Tell me what this brought up for you. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe now. We're here every week with stories exactly like this one. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.